Imagine a world connected by luxury goods, sophisticated diplomacy, and sprawling trade networks. In the 13th century BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean was a powerhouse. The Mycenaeans in Greece, the Hittites in Anatolia, the Egyptians under the New Kingdom, and the Babylonians were all bound together in a complex globalized system. It was an age of internationalism, where kings wrote to one another as brothers, exchanging gold, tin, copper, and precious lapis lazuli. It was a golden age, but it was also a system that relied on absolute stability. And then everything stopped. Around 1200 BCE, this interconnected world didn't just fade, it disintegrated. Within a few short decades, almost every major city from the Aegean to the Levant was destroyed. The Hittite Empire, a superpower that once challenged Egypt, simply ceased to exist as a centralized state. The Mycenaean palaces were reduced to ashes. Egypt survived, but it was a shell of its former self, never to reach those same heights again. We call this the Late Bronze Age collapse, and for a long time historians looked for a single smoking gun, a single culprit behind the catastrophe. Was it war? Was it natural disaster? Was it the mysterious sea peoples? As we dive deeper, we find that the truth is far more complex, and perhaps more relatable to our modern world than we ever dared to imagine. For decades, scholars pointed to the sea peoples. Ancient Egyptian inscriptions depict them as a loose confederation of seaborne raiders, a migratory force that swept across the Mediterranean like a tidal wave. They are often blamed for the destruction of the Hittites and the raids on the Egyptian coast. But modern archaeology tells a more nuanced story. Were they the cause of the collapse, or were they a symptom of it? We have to consider that these groups were likely refugees, displaced by their own environmental or political crises elsewhere, forced into a cycle of migration and conflict. They didn't appear out of thin air to destroy a functioning world. They arrived in a world that was already crumbling under the weight of its own fragility. This leads us to a key concept: the fragility of interconnectedness. When you have a globalized economy, you gain efficiency, but you lose resilience. The Bronze Age world relied on a complex supply chain. Bronze requires copper and tin. Copper was plentiful in Cyprus, but tin was rare and had to be imported from as far away as modern-day Afghanistan. If your trade routes are interrupted, you cannot make the tools, weapons, and agricultural implements that drive your society. This created a domino effect. When one link in the chain broke, perhaps due to a drought or a minor regional conflict, the entire system began to suffer. And unlike our modern world, these empires didn't have the luxury of backup suppliers or diversified economies. Then there was the climate. Paleoclimatologists looking at pollen samples in ancient sediment cores have discovered that the world changed right as the empire started to fall. A prolonged, centuries-long drought descended upon the eastern Mediterranean. This wasn't just a bad season for crops. It was a permanent shift that devastated the agricultural backbone of these civilizations. As food production plummeted, central governments were unable to feed their populations or supply their armies. Famine led to migration, which led to social unrest, which led to the breakdown of royal authority. When the people can no longer eat, they stop believing in the divinity of their kings, and the social contract collapses. But the collapse wasn't just about trade or weather. It was also about the internal contradictions of the palace economy. These civilizations were highly centralized. The king controlled the land, the labor, and the resources. This meant that the entire societal structure was top-heavy. If the king was strong, the kingdom thrived. If the king was weak, or if the bureaucracy became bloated and disconnected from the needs of the common people, the system lacked the grassroots flexibility to recover. By the time the external pressures arrived, these palaces had become brittle. They were like a rigid wall. When hit by a force, they didn't bend, they shattered. What happened after the collapse is perhaps the most intriguing part of the story. History books often refer to the following period as the Greek Dark Ages. It is characterized by a loss of literacy. The complex writing systems like linear B vanished, a decline in monumental architecture, and a drop in population. But it wasn't an absolute end to humanity. Instead, it was a transition. As the old top-heavy empires fell, new, smaller, and more resilient social structures emerged. Local identities began to flourish, and eventually this period of reorganization paved the way for the rise of the Iron Age, a time of new inventions and, eventually, the birth of the classical world. When we look at the Bronze Age collapse today, it serves as a powerful reminder of how quickly a complex system can unravel. It wasn't the work of one enemy or one disaster, but a perfect storm of climate change, economic failure, and social fragmentation. It suggests that civilization is not a linear march toward progress, but a delicate balance that must be maintained. The lesson of the Bronze Age isn't that humanity is destined to fall, but that we are always vulnerable to the systems we build for ourselves. As we look back, we have to ask ourselves, how much do we truly know about the people who lived through these final days? While the records tell us of kings and gods, they say very little about the daily life of the commoner who watched their world fall apart. History is often written by the victors or the ruling elites, but the story of the collapse belongs to everyone. It is a story of resilience as much as it is one of destruction. What do you think is the greatest risk to our own interconnected world today? Are we more prepared for the challenges of the future, or are we just as fragile as our predecessors? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey into the ancient past, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive into history's greatest mysteries. Thanks for watching.